years, I've been employed doing contracting work to actively pay on open source software that's being used by my customer. And today I really want to, immerse yourself in how does that look like, why I think it matters, and why I hope to inspire you to perhaps do the same thing. Let's start off first with a little experiment. Who uses open source software? All right, next question. Who has ever contributed a pull request? Who has ever contributed a pull request that, well, you really had to wrestle with? It took like more of an hour, just to put some kind of a marker on there. Interesting. And who has ever contributed a pull request on company time where your superior was clearly knowing that you were doing that contribution? All right, very happy to see a couple of hands. So I myself am in that last category, but it was kind of interesting to see that we seem to have lost some people in who uses open source and who is able to give back on company time. That's something we're also going to touch upon in this talk. But before we head into it, I briefly want to give an outline of my origin story when it comes to open source. I myself am an F# developer. F# is a functional programming language created by Microsoft. It is, well, less popular than its older sibling C#. And I didn't pick up F# as a first programming language. I sort of rolled into it because I was curious. It actually is a lot of fun, but I won't be going into those specifics. Point is, I entered a mentorship program from the F# Foundation. Now, the F# Foundation is an organization that encourages newcomers to pick up the language, to sort of facilitate everything they might find confusing, just to get more people on board with F#. They hold this mentorship program where they put a mentor and a mentee, well, basically from a similar time zone, and then you figure out what you want to do with that. In my case, I was paired with Anthony Lloyd. We jumped on some Skype calls, and during that first call, we just talked about, hey, what do you like in F#, or what do we want to do with this session? So it was really a free format. Now, I said to Anthony, what I miss the most in F# is like a code formatter. There's nothing in my IDE that shuffles around my code when I'm done writing and just puts it in a consistent fashion. And we started working on an open source project called Phantomus. Phantomus is, well, exactly that, an F# code formatter, but it wasn't really maintained well. It was just an experiment that, over time lost some interest by the maintainer. And during that mentorship program, we picked it up. From one thing came the other, and after the mentorship program, I eventually met Don Syme, the creator of F#, and he sort of maneuvered that this Phantomus project would go into an organization on GitHub, which meant that it was open to more community influence, that it just became a real thing, and then I got the keys to publish on NuGet, and before I knew it, I was the maintainer of the Phantomus project. And that really was a stepping stone, because Phantomus initially was not in a good state. It was kind of working, but the tricky thing for a code formatter is that, well, there's just a lot of code out there. So if you really want to reformat all the code, you need to be able to sort of predict what people will do in their code, and by now I can tell you, well, I've seen a lot. Phantomus just needed a bit of love, and it was good that it got a maintainer, and that was sort of my intro into doing something serious with F#. Because I was just picking it up as a hobby, as unfortunately a lot of people are, and it wasn't really a resume skill, but because of my investment in being this maintainer, I really felt more comfortable to call myself an F# developer. And I started looking for a job in F# I was doing consulting at the time. I wanted to find a customer that does that. But it was quite challenging, as I'm from Belgium, and in the Belgian market, there just is no F#. C# is heavily active in there, and it's all fine, and we don't need an alternative. And it's just nowhere close to home, so I started looking to the F# Foundation. They have a jobs channel, they run a Slack instance, and in that Slack instance, every once in a while, a lead was posted. And if there was like a job that said it was remote and could do with contracting, then I sort of jumped in on those, send them like an email explaining, hey, I'm looking for some real-world F# experience. I have some because of my Phantomus project. And at some point, Alex Gammon posted a message. It was a bit vague, but he said, I want to invest in the F# ecosystem. So, well, you couldn't really tell what that meant. But I reached out to him anyway, and I was sort of, hey, this Phantomus thing is, growing in the F# ecosystem, so potentially we have something in common. And when I jumped on a call with Alex, he mentioned I was representing a fintech company here in London based called G Research, and they were using F# in their applications, in the software they are writing, and they just wanted to give something back. So this is roughly 4 years ago. Their initial idea was to support some of the open source tools that they were actively using, just as a bit of an incentive, just to keep the maintainers, keep them occupied or keep them happy, or they would send a little bit of money here and there, just so that people feel appreciated. And I said to Alex, well, yes, this might be a good fit, because what we do with Phantomus, it's in a good place, but it's really, it's not widely used. For an example, Phantomus was not able to format most of the code bases if you would try it in the wild. It really worked with new projects, and it worked if you kept within certain boundaries. And at the time I was doing consulting, so I sort of pitched, hey, this might be something that's worth sponsoring, well, significantly, so that it could be, picked up and we could refactor some of the things which we would never be able to do in our spare time. And then Alex said, well, that's not really my initial vision, but I could give you some money in the month, like some money, just it buys you coffee and then helps you run any cloud tools you want. And, well, regrettably, I just said no. If you give me that small amount of money, in practice, nothing really happens. And if it's like a fair amount of money, but only if every company that would use Phantomus gives you that, you get enough money to finally, do this work during your day job. And he understood that Phantomus has ties all over the F# community and even uses bits of the F# compiler. So it is in a, interesting and complicated space. The work is real. That's basically what I told Alex, and we found an agreement. I was able to do contracting work for G Research to work on Phantomus, and that was just really the sweet spot. I landed my first F# gig, and it was just a very good plus that I was able to work on my own open source project. I was able to provide, do the work every 1 day in the week, and I nicknamed that my happy day, and the contract was actually a good bang for buck. I was able to really refactor a couple of the weaker areas, and Phantomus grew better and better. More people started using it because it's a very disappointing story the first time you use a code formatter and it just doesn't format a couple of your files. But we were getting over those limitations. It really became usable, and they had some feature requests for how they wanted to use it inside of G Research. And after a couple of renewed contracts, that actually was a reality. Phantomus has ties to the F# compiler, and at some point, if I really wanted to improve Phantomus even further, or remove the hacks we had today, I needed to fix our downstream dependency, which is the F# parser and the abstract syntax tree. Now, those are scary things that happen in the F# compiler. I won't really go into those, but it's eventually led me to, hey, I need to fix something in somebody else's project. And that other project was the F# compiler, well, which just was, just this mythical thing that, well, you don't think of yourself that you're clever enough to do any of that. And so I reached out to this fine gentleman. This is Chet Husk. He is a community F# hero. He knows a lot of things, and he's just actively maintaining the F# tooling in Visual Studio Code, which is called Ionite. And Chet didn't work for Microsoft at the time, but eventually now he does. And he just taught me a couple of things about the F# parser. He went on a call with me. After 2 hours, I felt like I learned enough, and I was able to do PRs on my own after that initial introduction that I got from him. And after that, Phantomus really was getting good enough that it is now used by the F# team itself on that same F# compiler code base. So it's really interesting to see how that all just kind of evolved. Till this day, I consider Phantomus 5, our last major version, which we released in September of last year, to be my crown achievement in software development. It is really, behind the scenes, it's amazing where we came from and what it does now, but it's also great to see that I was able to grow the community around Phantomus. Because if it's all me doing the work, well, that just doesn't scale. So you try to involve more people to be in there and to sort of limit the risk that if I ever lose interest or anything, that it keeps on going, that there's more people that want to carry the project. And this is a picture of our release party. I felt like it was important enough to have a release party, so we had some champagne and all good stuff. But it was really interesting to see people all over the world getting involved in your project. And well, this all is a bit of a pat on the back, but I feel like I gave the F# ecosystem a code formatter, which it didn't have. And the secret ingredient in all of that is money. So this is the biggest point I'm going to make in this talk, and that's the help that G Research put into this and in giving me the time to work on this. That was really what made that work. And over the years, G Research expanded their vision on what open source meant to them. It started by giving some individual contributors a small amount of money, or those asking for more and then pulled it off, got a little more. But now it's like an open source division. It's really a separate team that operates. There's 30 of us worldwide, and that just operates on all the needs that they have in the engineering teams in London. So this is no strict philanthropy. The input is really coming from the teams, and every little thing that's not working, but that is open source, it just gets thrown to the open source team. What can we do about this? Do we have the expertise? Do we know the people who are doing anything with that? Can we have that fixed? And G Research actually has a lot of more problems than just formatting, and they has a lot of more problems than formatting. But before I touch upon that, why would a company invest in open source that they actively have 30 people worldwide working on that? Who does that? A couple of points I want to make there is that open source can be an alternative to a commercial product when you have to pay a license per developer, and if you use all that money you would need to spend on a license to contribute the one missing thing that the open source project doesn't have, well then that's a clever investment. In other cases, when you're using open source, you're actually taking a bet on something. If you're already using a free open source product, but it's only run by one company or one individual, actually that's a risk. If you're using that in the parts of your software that is bringing in the money, then it's interesting to contribute back to that open source project, just so you know that it will withstand the test of time, that more people make it clear that they have a stake in this, and that the project will survive. And if you go that route, you eventually can have like a seat at the table. A good example of that is my colleague Jay. He's working with OpenStack, and OpenStack has sort of a leadership board, all people from different companies coming and determining the roadmap and the future of the project. And because of Jay's contributions, he really got accepted and got heard to be in that board. And now the agenda of G Research is being represented in a product which they use fairly oftenly. Time went on, and there was appetite at some point enough for more F# work. So as I tried to mention, formatting code wasn't the only problem that they have. There was some real issues that they were having with F# because they use it on a large scale. And yeah, things didn't really got resolved, so they wanted to contribute or help where they can. And at a certain point, Alex offered me like a full-time position on the open source team to do exactly that. Now, the work I'm now doing for G Research is, well, different than Phantomus. In Phantomus, it's my own little isolated project where I'm the maintainer. But here, it is really contributing to the compiler. They use JetBrains Rider mostly for their tooling, for the IDE. And the F# plugin in Rider is also open source, so there's also a means to help there. And sometimes they just have issues with things like MS-Build or NuGet or whatever's in the .NET SDK, which is also all open source. So it's a very different job, and by doing that, I would like to make 7 points of how does it look like to be an open source contributor to those kind of projects. And first of all, who has done anything in .NET, by the way? Okay, that's almost everybody, but in case you haven't, I don't really want this to be a very technical talk, but some examples will be more technical because it makes a bit more sense. For those who have no idea what .NET is, in .NET you can have something is called a solution file. A solution file will hold together a bunch of projects. A project is in a specific programming language, be it C# or F# in our case. It creates a binary, projects can depend on each other, all that good kind of stuff. Now at G-Research, they just have a lot of it, and it just brings friction on so many levels because, well, from opening your solution with a lot of projects, that just takes a lot of time. NuGet restores take a lot of time. Building code takes a lot of time. Doing one little change can just cascade, and, well, developers just aren't overly happy, and because of their mix with, C# and F#, it just is really getting problematic. Which brings us to a first point I wanted to make, is that in open source, everybody has their own agenda. So as established, Microsoft is behind both C# and F#, and they must have seen this problem before. So you might wonder, why are they not just fixing that? They'll probably have a stake in that, but, well, that's not necessarily true. The customer base in, from Microsoft's point of view, their customer base doing F# is a lot smaller compared to C#. The ones that are mixing F# and C# is again smaller, and the ones that doing it on a large scale, well, maybe it's only G-Research that's brave enough to do it like that. So you're getting into a bit of a space where the maintainers, in our case the F# team, just has different priorities. This isn't important enough for them to tackle because it's not on their agenda, which again is understandable. But it brings us to the next slide, and we have this large, difficult problem that is not interesting enough for the maintainers to pick up, but it's just too large and complex, so it's not going to be picked up by any stranger, or it's just going to solve itself. So on both ends of the spectrum here, you cannot say that over time this will all of a sudden just be solved, this problem, which is not the case. Just because the F# team isn't going to be solving that, that doesn't mean they weren't open to talking about that. Us showing initiative like, hey, we want to tackle this, was a good conversation, and it led to, you could use reference assemblies. Has anybody ever heard of a reference assembly? It is it looks like a regular assembly, but you throw out all the private bits and all the implementation. So it contains exactly the same public API, and it's interesting to use when you're building multiple projects. If your dependencies are reference assemblies, then you don't need to recompile. And in that large solution, if you make a change and you compile your project, if the reference assembly didn't change, you can identify that, oh, this other project doesn't need to change because that dependency didn't change. Basically, this has been around for a couple of years for C#, but it just doesn't exist for F#. And the F# team was close, but it never landed, and it looked like it just wasn't going to land for .NET 7. So what we did is we contributed the missing pieces. We looked at open tickets in both the MS Build repository, the F# repository, and we were just looking like, hey, we really want this. Where can we help? A bit technical. What we actually did was do some missing MS Build work, expose some compiler flags. So the difficult part of generating and consuming a reference assembly was already done in the compiler. So that was good. I mean, most of the headache was done. But they just needed to connect it all and get it shipped into the SDK. And I'm just going to make a bold claim here, but I feel like without us pushing for this and doing this work, we still wouldn't have had it in .NET 7. And that's, again, because the F# team had different priorities. When we were doing all those contributions, in open source, when you contribute to something that's not your own, it's like, yeah, it's their house, so you need to play by their rules. We, did everything they asked. We, did the work entirely similar to how it works in C#. So we didn't invent any new concepts or whatnot. What you have in your CS proj is, exactly the same as your FS proj. And you really want to do that so that your changes will blend in as easy as possible. That's for the maintainers always interesting to, or they're going to be more comfortable with having those changes, contrary to inventing your own system or doing your own thing and just not playing ball. Which brings me to the next point. Sometimes you really need to have patience, and the coding bit is the least jarring. With the F# team, by now we have like a good understanding, a good relation. We know the people, we send regularly some PRs, and that connection's there. But for the .NET SDK team, well, we didn't really know them. So we had a pull request open, like, hey, the F# team told us to do this, and now it's there. But that PR was open for 3 weeks, and we didn't really get a response. Just by doing the work, that doesn't really mean anything. And we really needed to maneuver a little bit on that one to get it merged in. Which brings me to my next point, is that, well, you're only allowed to read the code. When we're talking about open source, I feel like the only thing that's truly always true is that you can read the code. If you open an issue, if you open a pull request to somebody else's project, you might get a response, but you're not entitled to anything. So you're also not aware of what happens on the other side of the conversation. Us opening that PR for the .NET SDK, well, we didn't really know. Is that, do they want this? Do they not want this? And the problem turned out to be that it's just very difficult for them to make a decision rather late in the game of the release cycle. But it was all a bit, behind the scenes politics at Microsoft. And Chet Hesk, which I mentioned previously, is now working near those teams in the SDK, and I was able to reach out to him to eventually get our codes merged. Which brings me to my next point. It really helps in open source when you get to know the people. Another related story is that the F# team has expanded. They are building the Prague office, and they add like 3 to 4 new people in the F# team. It is really great to see, because I feel in team size, the F# team has never been bigger. And the new people being there, it's just great. But, I don't like change. And it was kind of difficult for me to wrap my head around that I didn't get any response from the new guys. I've been contributing some of the work for the F# parser. Don Syme was still more involved. He looked at it, he merged it. I feel like we had an understanding, and those new guys weren't, really looking into it, not really giving any review. Or when they gave a review, they gave like a very serious nitpick that Don and 10 previous similar PRs didn't really look at it. And the way I sort of dealt with that is like, okay, I want to jump on a call with these people. I just reached out to them like, hey, I'm Florian, you might know me from my handle. I'm a bit active in F#, but I would like to give some more context of why it is what I'm doing. And then I told them like, hey, I'm a third-party contributor for an organization called G Research. And once we had that short call, it just changed so much. A lot of things went a lot smoother just because you get to know the people. We were no longer strangers on the internet after that. Another thing that we noticed in our large solution is that, compiling F# takes a lot longer than compiling C#. When we were profiling the compilation, we noticed that type checking, which is one of the phases in the compilation, is taking, one of the longest times, and it is single-threaded. Now, this is single-threaded because in F# the order matters, and once you know that, it's intrinsic to the language, you understand why this is, but for those who don't know, file order matters in F#. If you have a project with the following files, you can use everything you define publicly in A, you can use that in B and C, but everything in B cannot be used in A because A came after B, and only stuff that's in B is known to what comes after B. That's just how F# works. Once you learn to live with that, you start appreciating it, but it just meant that it happened, it has an influence on how the compiler cannot really be parallelized. Then there's a thing called a signature file in F#. A signature file is a bit like a header file, C++. It also draws a bit of a parallel with that reference assembly. So it really contains the public API that you have in a file. It exposes that, and that already has some existing tooling benefits. This is what a signature file looks like. So on the left, we have some F# code. That is a Fibonacci sequence. And on the right is its matching signature. The point I try to make with this is that both files have the same information. So you need to do some more parsing on the left to figure out what's on the same information that's on the right, but you can use signature files. It's a lesser known thing in F#. But when you use signature files, your editor will actually use that information, because it is equivalent to your implementation, when you need IntelliSense in your editor. So in this case, when you open the file C, it needs to know everything that came before it, but because a signature file has the same information as an implementation, you sort of skip the implementation and just use everything from a signature file. So don't worry if this is overly complex, but it just gives you a bit of an idea that, well, this work is kind of complex. So the random stranger, well, this is another one of the reasons it's not getting picked up. It's rather complex. And there was, so this works in the editor today, and there was an existing experiment like, hey, can we have this for compilation as well? So when you just .NET builds, and then eventually MS Build kicks in the compiler, could we not use a similar approach where if you have a signature file, you can, leverage the same gimmick? And there was an existing experiment by Will Smith, not the actor, but someone who works at Microsoft and who's now in another team. And, well, we just knew that the PR wasn't going to get picked up, but it was valuable what he has been looking into. And that's when I just tried to pick up his experiment, which was doing type checking in 2 phases. Again, I'm just going to gloss over this, but the sequential phase, because of the way F# works, you still need to go over all the files. But when you have a file that has a signature file, you just skip it, and then afterwards you can circle back and do the type checking of those files that you skipped in parallel. This is a new feature that's in the .NET 7 SDK, which we contributed. It has an obscure tests compiler flag. It's probably not for everybody, but it was really cool that we got that merged in. Which brings me to a next point. So I was able to pick up Will's experiment. The idea was already there, but, well, I understood that I bit more off than I could chew, and I had something working, but, yeah, will this ever work for all of F#? Because that's typical the amount of reasoning you have to do. Having one working example, well, isn't going to cut it. So I reached out to Don, as I was asking, hey, I have something, it works, could we go over this? I'm quite interested to hear your thoughts on that. Don is a very busy man, and there's a certain form of art in approaching him to get him to look at your stuff, but he had a half hour of time. But because I already had my pull request and we were able to look at that hands-on, that half hour turned into 4 hours, and afterwards we really had a working implementation that would figure out all the missing details. Because one of the examples that I totally didn't think about is like, what happens if you have error logging? So my one working example, everything in the type checking, the code was correct, so it creates a binary. What if the code isn't correct? In what order should you see the error messages? You should see them in the same order as if you would if you not do anything in parallel. So, well, complicated stuff like that we just figured out, and the good pointer there is that I was able to just talk shop to make this hands-on, and that just piqued on his interest a lot more. Signature files is actually a bit of a pain to work with. So we had reference assemblies, we had this new compiler flag, it was all going to be in .NET 7, but then you still need to convince your customer to put all those things on, that they actually use it. When your implementation file changes, you need to update your signature file as well, and that's like double bookkeeping. So depending on what you do in that specific file, well, it's still rather painful. So then I tried to get some Alt-Enter resharper magic in there. Like that plugin is also open source. You can see there, I just added a little Alt-Enter thing. If more tooling like that existed, then the whole notion of signature files could definitely be sold a lot better. But the problem there is that I was treading new ground. Rider doesn't really have much tooling for signature files. They only have 2 people working on the F# tooling, so they don't cover everything for now. They were very interested in the idea, but merging a PR into the plugin for Rider just has a very high entry bar. They really need to know that this will work for everything that their customers will throw at it, otherwise they don't really want it. So I was not able to merge or get my pull request merged with this example. I got some of the more easier ones in there, but I'll still need to work on that, because as a contributor, you need to ensure that your PR is worth maintaining. Because when you create a PR, you do all the changes, but yeah, then once it's merged, it's merged. I mean, you're gone. You don't really, promise anything, or it's not a contract that you will indefinitely maintain those 20 lines that you changed. So that's why sometimes it really helps that you can prove your changes are maintainable, are isolated, are well tested, are well documented, and that really all helps in grammar narrative. Signature files are painful when you need to update them, but they're also painful when you just don't have them. It was a bit easier for me to create some tool that creates your initial signature file. You can do that with the F# compiler. If there's another obscure flag, if you know about it, it can generate it. But the code looks horrible, and it has a lot of bugs. Good citizen as I am, I try to fix those bugs. But yeah, the .NET SDK releases when it releases. I'm still very in the dark when that actually happens. Yeah, no, it's like 4 times a year, and then you fix something, and then you didn't meet the code freeze they had at Microsoft, which you of course don't know about. Yeah, it's all a bit frustrating. So I just rolled my own thing, and the point I'm trying to make is that it is, always very inspiring that you agree and help and build on the same software, and sometimes you just don't. You want to roll your own thing. If there's a bug in this thing called Telplant, it's just a CLI tool that generates your signature file. If you found a bug and there's interest to fix it, we'll have a new version of that Telplant tomorrow. So that's just another side of the coin when it came to signature files. And it was also just another way of getting something out of that .NET 7 release, because it focuses on signature files. Cool. So I made a couple of points about how it looks like as a contributor, but I still am the maintainer of Phantomus. How do I reply to the same points when I'm on the other side of the conversation? That's something I also want to discuss in this talk, and how that looks like. So when it comes to Phantomus, it is a code formatter, and I'm very much a benevolent dictator of that project. Initially, it was a good thing. Now I'm trying to steer away from it. But what this means is that my agenda, got all the, was actually the driving force. And a lot of people open issues and want, could we have this, which is a slight change of how the style is outputted, and we could have it behind the settings flag so everybody can have his own thing. But I was like, no. I mean, knowing where Phantomus came from, it was just a horrible tool. So we needed to get it better first. I preferred to have a working tool, which was my agenda, before we could go over and have all the features or things that everybody ever wanted. To settle on something, because style is such a delicate topic for most people, we settled on the F# style guides. This is a document by Microsoft and the community, which you can find on docs.net.com. And basically, it gives you the best way to start writing F#, like how should you structure your code. This is what it typically looks like. Just because you can make some mistakes as a beginner, well, coming from another language or overusing a certain influence you already had. And there's the style guide that tells you how code could look like if you were all doing it in a consistent way. And that's what we settle upon. Everything that gets in the style guide will get into Phantomus. And I don't have to like it anymore, but if it's in the style guide, that's just how we do it. You can submit a change, an RFC for a change in that style guide. If you really think you have a good idea, then I'm all ears. But please prove that your idea is more about, hey, this is what I wrote, and now it's different, I don't like that. Just prove that there's really a weakness in the style guide, and I think the whole community could benefit from having that change. Which leads me to, play ball, have patience. You can change Phantomus, I'm okay with that. But I'm less okay with, everybody wanting stuff and nobody doing stuff, and it just doesn't bring me to my agenda, which is just a working tool. So have patience and play ball. Of course, there are exceptions. G-Research sponsored me to work on Phantomus so they can have their own style guide. They actually had it before Microsoft had it. And there are a couple of things in there which you can just toggle with a feature flag, which is exactly the thing I said other people can't have. Well, this is just a bit nepotism one-on-one. But G-Research sponsored everything. They could have just forked Phantomus, did all the same things that they had, and they had the same results. So they really encouraged me, like, hey, create community around this. We are not the only ones that are going to use this tool, and we want to ensure that it's, that it remains a viable tool for the next 10 years, give or take. Just ensure its survival. Another interesting feature is called Strustrup, which is what we see on the right here. So we're looking at F# records, and a lot of people have different opinions of how they should look like. On the left, we have what the F# style guide currently says. In the middle, we have what the G-Research style guide says. And then every 2 to 3 months, I got a new issue feature request like, hey, can we still have the third thing? And I was like, yeah, no, please, style guide, all those things. But I got that request quite often, and suddenly just had a change of heart. Like, there's a lot of technical reasons why you don't want to have this, but sometimes a bad idea is a bad idea worth having. And the gamble in this was that, hey, if we do this anyway, maybe I can lure in a new contributor. And it all worked out pretty well. So there's this wonderful guy named Josh from America who really wanted to do this Strustrup style. And he had patience and he played ball. He contributed. We went on a lot of pair programming sessions. And just this morning, the pull request to the F# style guide to have Strustrup as an official thing, so he also wrote documentation for that part as well, that got merged. So it really is a truly supported official thing. And my net result was that, yeah, Josh is now on board. Josh is pretty much becoming a core contributor. And I'm very close to giving him, the keys to the city, or the keys to push to NuGet. When you open a pull request for Phantomus, we have a couple of rules. Phantomus basically is input-output is with, code comes in, formatted code comes out, so it's like string to string. And this lends itself very well to do test-driven development. So every PR you're going to do, I'm going to ask for you to add a test, like why is this change necessary? And will it, well, mostly for that, but will this now problem work forever? Because if you add a test, then the next contribution we have, which changes something unrelated, if your test is breaking, then the next thing is not going to get merged in, and your work that you once did will always be there. We also have some more silly rules, like unit tests start with a lowercase. At some point, we noticed that the vast majority had a lowercase, so we just put it in our documentation. Also, please use this template with a lowercase. Is the template good? It's decent, but it's just, we have 3,000 of those tests. We don't really need like a new way of doing the tests. It's a bit too, it's a bit too late for all that. So just stick with what's already out there, and your changes will blend in a lot easier. I also want to rant a bit about GitHub issue trackers. A lot of people open issues, and being a maintainer for a project for a couple of years now, I've seen it all. And I just want to highlight that opening an issue might not have the effect that you think it has. But when you do open an issue, so the reminder here is that you're allowed to read the code. When you do open an issue, yeah, the polite thing is to have a reply from me, but even that is not necessarily a given. And on the other side, as a maintainer, you just really wish that, yeah, when you get issues, depending on your mood or timing, or you're just not responding to the issue on a shortly, timely manner, or you're not responding at all because it's very complicated from your end, but you're never really letting anybody know why it's complicated, and it just happens. So yeah, again, you're allowed to read the code. But when you do open an issue, I actually really want to thank you. It shows that you have interest in this project. It typically shows that you are invested enough to report something that's not working for you. And I just say thanks. It's really a good way to start the conversation. But then at the same time, I will take a look at where I think your bug is in the code base, and then I'm going to point that out, and I'm just going to ask, are you interested in submitting a pull request? just bouncing it back to you. It's like, at this point, you are having a problem, nobody's going to save you, but this is how you do it. My typical reply is, well, no, people aren't really interested enough. It's like I guess 30% of people just really does something with the feedback I give and then does that one-time request, pull request, and then you never hear from them, but then their problem was solved, so that's really cool. A lot of times you get the typical excuses, and here I just want to, let you know that I don't really believe the no time excuse works very well. When you say you don't have time, that's a bit of a lie. You just don't want to do it, and just put it like that, please. Because when you have no time, I'm like, really? You wrote 2 pages on explaining the bug or the problem that you have or how it makes you feel, but then you have no more time left in your life to really talk about, let's try and be part of the solution. So yeah, there's no such thing as no time. I feel like everybody definitely can have an hour, or it really changes the conversation. Like, hey, I looked at it for an hour, it's out of my league, I was stuck there. That's a much better reply, and I will typically be more engaged to help you out than when you just say you don't have time. Well, I'm saying, yeah, I might not have time either, so who knows. Then there's a next wonderful group that says, oh, but I feel like I'm helping this project by raising the issues. And well, I mean, a lot of projects, that's the case. In Phantomus, it is not. I really don't like it when you open an issue and we have the same conversation over and over. So this really happens with a couple of people where I just do the same thing. I really say thank you for opening an issue. It's like, good to see you again. Here's the problem. Are you interested in solving? They say no. I say, fine. 1 week later, here's an issue. Hey, problem fixed, there, go. No, up yours. But when you do this 5 times in a row, it's really, what's the point? So yeah, I'm very frustrated, and I don't believe that you're always helping just by reporting an issue. In certain projects, which like mine are just used by everybody, but they're not in a position that you would charge people for it, then you just need to be part of the solution as well. And a lot of it is mentality, and every once in a while you get a wild unicorn. In my case, it was a guy named Dawe. That was his GitHub handle. I had no idea who he was, but he was solving his own problem. He was even correcting typos in the documentation, and all of a sudden he was fixing other people's problems, because I do try to leave a pointer for everything, and then this Dawe guy was doing that. And he had like 20 PRs merged. I'm like, who are you? What drives you? I'm so confused. And then I found his email address and sent him an email. I wasn't really sure what to ask him, but I just really wanted to meet him. And we did just chat. A very short call. Turned out he's from Germany. He's David. He likes F# and he likes to contribute back. And they are using Phantomus at work. That was kind of the story. But meeting David was really, very important, because after he did that, the next morning, he already got the next pull request. So it really, was very good to engage people, and reaching out via a call or in person, that just really changes the dynamic that you work with people. So it was very interesting, and David expressed that he was interested in doing more, because I sort of spooned it in, and I sent him on a bit of a hero's journey. He did more and more. We had some more pair programming sessions for the more difficult stuff, and at the end, when the Phantomus 5 was the release party, I announced that David is now co-maintainer. This is the first person that I actually gave the keys to the city, and he got his first release. So he first pushed to NuGet, create the GitHub release page, and that's very significantly, because I am no longer the blocking factor of this project getting releases, and that's exactly how it should be. So from a maintainer's point of view, I feel like I've done enough on the technical side, but I really want to create and engage and create community so more people can do this and share the load. Another good example is when someone opens an issue, you can immediately tell, like, do they know what they are talking about, or is this just a bit of a random rant? And there was this guy who, in the Telplum project, really went into the code and found a bug which I knew existed, was hard at the time, like, yeah, nobody will notice. Well, he did, and he really started looking into the code and how can we fix this, really trying to be part of the solution. And at some point, he really proposed 2 PRs, and I was like a Roman Empire. I could do like this, yes, we're going to use the second one. It was super cool to just see that, and the level of engagement, I'm quite sure that we both spent the same amount of time on the problem, but I would never have put in that much of the time if he, just opened an issue with one line, said, hey, this doesn't work. But because he was really, invested enough in fixing this and jumping to the code, that really gets you as a maintainer to, meet him halfway. And I chose the second option that he actually did do the 2 PRs, and this is kind of cool to see. But I chose the second implementation because it's easier to maintain. The problem is definitely not solved for the entirety of the F# language, but if we have it again, it will be very obvious in what area we still need to do a change, and that's why I went with that second PR. So the conclusion to this, that it is a lot of fun, and both as a maintainer and a contributor. In terms of contributions, I really think it's important because all the work we do with the open source team, it is nothing that would ever be picked up if we didn't do it. So it's very important that more companies start investing in open source and in giving back to the projects that they are using. And that doesn't necessarily have to be like a grand division like G-Research had. It's a large company. If you're a smaller company, that could just be your developers spending Friday afternoon working on the stuff they are using. If you don't know where to begin, you can always just clone the repository and try to get everything building. That really is a good step, and you'll have a better understanding of how things work. And I must say, because of all the scary F# compiler stuff, I really gained a broader perspective of what software development could be. So it's really a bit of a foreign area for a lot of people, but once you get in there, well, you manage, and you really meet a lot of good things. So that is kind of the end, but I do want to tack on a little epilogue. I also want to talk about Edgar. Edgar is a fine gentleman we see here. Edgar works here in London as well, and we met at a F# meetup. And Edgar is also very new to F#. I was also very confused by certain things of error messages. And he said, hey, I'm a bit inspired by you actually doing something in open source. Could we not do those things as well? So the F# meetup happens here in London and is actually facilitated by G-Research. So it was kind of interesting for me to eventually give a talk there as well about some of the Phantomus work I've been doing. And it's again a good message for them. And Edgar joined that meetup, and afterwards we just stayed in touch. And he talked about, yeah, I want to do the same things, but just like I had a mentor chat at the beginning, he needed some kind of a mentor figure to show him the ropes. He downloaded, the F# compiler, got it to build, but he was like, what do I do next? And eventually we found some sort of agreement, Edgar and I, that we would be working sort of pair programming sessions, just one-on-one. He was able to use his company budgets because, I'm definitely okay with one session, but he was like, oh, can I book you for the rest of the year? Well, I was like, maybe, let's see. But then we did a couple of those sessions, and it wasn't, again, a different agenda to what G-Research was doing, so we had to do it in sort of an outside of that time slot. But it was a lot of fun, and I really was able to teach Edgar a lot of things. And this truly is your zero to hero story, because when working with Edgar in pair programming, you could see that he, didn't, understand all aspects of the F# language from time to time, but that didn't stop him. It's all about mentality. 6 months ago, he couldn't do anything, and now he already has like 30 PRs merged. And it really, there's no excuse. Everybody can help, and a story like Edgar is really very nice to see. And, that's even more, he's unstoppable, and one day he will surpass me, so it's, I'm orchestrating my own demise. But in a good way. And To wrap up this talk, I would like to leave you with some sour thought. This is Philip Carter's blog post from December. Philip was the previous team lead of the F# team, and he basically, expressed that F# is an open source project, and if you're using F#, Microsoft is just another contributor. So everything that you think Microsoft isn't picking up, or frustrations you might have that you then post on the internet, because that's what you do, no, don't do it. Try and get your own agenda in F#, try to contribute to get it somewhere, and just be the change in the world you want to be. And now this is really the end. I was Florian. Thank you all so much for coming to this talk. If you have any questions, I'll be around. Red, green, orange thingy when you go outside. Thank you all.